Hello, I wanted to talk a little bit about neurons and neurotransmitters and why they're interesting to us in psychology. So, we're going to talk about the function of neurons, we're going to talk about how neurons communicate, we're going to talk about how an action potential happens, and then we're going to talk about the function of neurotransmitters, which is what really interests us in psychology. We know that neurotransmitters play an important role in many of the psychological disorders: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, even. And then we'll talk a little bit about SSRIs, which are antidepressant medications, and we'll talk how they work. But first of all, we have to understand how the nervous system works. So the nervous system's most basic unit is the neuron, and the neuron's a microscopic cell within our nerves that sends and receives information. And the neurons do this by creating an electrical charge that sends chemical messages, and the chemical messages that they send are neurotransmitters. We have 100 billion neurons within our body. It's a pretty amazing number. And we have an equal amount of glial cells within our nervous system that just help to support those neurons. We have neural networks in our brain that are constantly changing. So when we learn something new, we're activating a whole network of neurons. And When we think about that information that we learned, we're actually activating those exact same neurons. And so the more we use information, the stronger the connections between those neurons become, and the stronger those memories become, and the less likely we are to forget that information. However, if we don't use information that we've studied or learned, eventually those connections just kind of weaken and eventually they go away. And we've all had that experience where you've studied really hard for a test, you knew the information, you did well on the test, and a few months later you don't remember anything of that information. And that's because if we don't use information, it often just goes away. And we'll talk about memory in chapter 8, and this is very related to memory. It's the same thing with memory. When we remember something or memorize something, it activates a whole network of neurons. And if we continue to use that network of neurons, those connections remain really strong. But if we don't use that network of neurons, eventually those connections go away and we don't remember it anymore. So this is an interesting study that was done at Vanderbilt University a few years ago, and they wanted to answer the age-old question, are cats smarter than dogs? And they came up with the idea that the more neurons that are found in a brain, the higher the intelligence level. And they're definitely right about it. If you think about it, the more neurons you have, the more connections you can make, the more you can learn. Definitely they're accurate in that assumption. And so what they did was they measured the number of neurons in a cat's brain versus the dog's brain. And what do you guys think they found? We like to think of cats as being pretty smart and kind of aloof, and they seem sort of smart. And our dogs seem like maybe they're a little gullible, maybe a little too easy to please, and they don't come off as quite as smart. However, this study actually proved that dogs are much smarter than cats. So they found that the dogs had 530 million cortical neurons, which this means neurons within their brain, versus the cats who only had 250 million neurons in their brain. And then if you look at us, we have 16 billion cortical neurons. So we have 100 billion neurons throughout our whole body, but within our brain we have 16 billion. And if you think about how that compares to a dog and or a cat, that's pretty amazing to think about it. But the dogs are actually twice as smart as the cats. So what do you guys think about wild animals versus domesticated animals? We might think that wild animals would be a lot smarter than our pets at home because they have to use their wits to survive out there, and the dogs just sitting there waiting for us to feed them, right? But they actually found that domestic animals were just as smart as those wild animals. So apparently our dogs and cats are just using their wits to work us rather than surviving out in the wild. In the study, they also found that a golden retriever was smarter than a brown bear, which is kind of interesting. Bears are actually afraid of dogs. A barking dog can actually chase a brown bear up a tree. So definitely some accuracy to that information. So there's 3 different types of neurons I want you to know about. You don't have to memorize this for the test, but I think it's really helpful in understanding how the whole nervous system is sort of set up. So we have sensory neurons that take sensory information from our senses, from our sense of hearing, our sense of taste, our sense of vision, touch, all sorts of senses that we have, and it takes that information and sends it to the brain. Then we have motor neurons that activate our muscles and glands and allow us to move. And then we have what they call inner neurons that form these vast neural networks that can create intelligence and consciousness and really our ability to actually think. So let's talk a little bit about the parts of the neuron and an action potential and how that happens. So the cell body is just the main part of a neuron. It has a nucleus inside of it that actually contains DNA. And just other structures that nourish the cell. Actually, every cell in our body contains DNA except for red blood cells for some reason. But that's why at crime scenes they can get a skin cell, a hair cell, and actually they can take a saliva sample and get our DNA too. So our DNA is throughout our whole system and throughout every cell in our body except for the red blood cells. So the cell body is just where, it's just the main body of the neuron. The dendrites are these little branch-like things that come outside of the neuron, and what they do is actually receive messages from other neurons, and they absorb the chemical messengers that the other neurons are sending. And a neuron can get a message from multiple other neurons, so it's not just one other neuron. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 neurons that are actually sending a message to this single neuron. And once those chemicals get absorbed and they get to a certain level, then that neuron actually fires down what we call its action potential or its nerve impulse. It sends that message down the axon, and it can send that message up to 200 miles per hour. So kind of interesting. And then when we get to the end of the axon, we have what they call terminal buttons at the end of the axon. And these little buttons actually secrete chemicals called neurotransmitters into the synapse for the dendrites of the next neuron to absorb. So the synapse or the synaptic cleft, so they use this term synaptic cleft in the book, and it's just the tiny gap between, this is a terminal button of an axon, and this is a dendrite that's absorbing those neurotransmitters. So the synaptic cleft is just the space between those two, and it's where communication occurs between the neuron, and it's where neurotransmitters are secreted into that synaptic cleft. So this is an example of what it might look like. This is actually a true microscopic image of motor neurons. And you kind of notice they're sort of sloppily, they're not very well organized. You can see some dendrites coming out here. This one looks a little more organized. But they're kind of on top of each other. They're not like lined up next to each other. And then you'll see all these little black dots in here. Those are actually the glial cells that support the neurons within the nervous system. And the other point I wanted to make that wasn't real clear in the book is that neurons only have one axon. They can't have more than one axon. So they can have multiple dendrites that receive that chemical message, but they only have one axon that actually sends that message. And this is an example of what an axon might look like. It's kind of a, I don't know if it's an artist rendering or not, but I wanted you to pay attention to this myelin sheath here. And what this is a fatty layer that coats that axon. And what it does is allow messages to get sent more rapidly and efficiently through that axon onto the next neuron. And you'll notice these little gaps in here on the myelin sheath. They're called nodes of Ranvier. I don't know why they have such a fancy name. It's probably named after a person. But they also help to allow that message to get sent more quickly, so it sort of skips across there. I don't know if you guys have heard these terms white matter and gray matter. We don't use them a lot in psychology anymore, but the reason why they call them white matter is that they're white. So the axons, the images you've seen of axons are actually white, and that myelin layer that covers it is also white. So that's often referred to as white matter. And then the gray matter it contains the neurons. And the interesting thing about this myelin layer is that people that suffer from multiple sclerosis have an immune system that actually attacks this myelin sheath, and what happens is it makes it difficult for the nervous system to send messages, motor messages, other messages, and it's something that is very troubling for people that suffer from multiple sclerosis. And there's a lot of research in trying to figure out how can we replenish this layer, this myelin sheath. It seems like such a simple thing to be missing, and yet it causes people to have some pretty severe problems. Okay, so what happens when a neuron fires its action potential? So we're going to talk about this. So we have a little neuron sitting here, and it's at its resting potential. So it has a neutral charge. And then it starts getting messages sent from other neurons, and it starts absorbing those chemicals. And what happens is the sodium gates open, so the sodium level rises inside the neuron, and the potassium gates close, so that level lowers, and it creates a electrical charge, and once it gets to a certain level, a threshold level, it actually fires off its action potential. And once that little neuron's fired off its action potential, it has to go through this repolarization process because all of the chemicals inside that neuron are now completely depleted. So it has to replenish those chemicals. So after firing its action potential, the sodium gates of the neuron close, the sodium moves out of the cell, the potassium gates open, and potassium moves in there, and it gets back to its resting potential. But the neuron's not able to fire at this point because it has to get back to that resting potential, and they call that hyperpolarization because it's just not ready to fire until the chemicals get replenished in the system. So neurotransmitters are what we call the chemical messengers of the brain, and they're found in the terminal buds of the axons, and they get secreted into the synapse or the synaptic cleft during an action potential. So this is what it looks like. So this is an axon and a terminal button of an axon, and inside that terminal button there's all these little sacs of neurotransmitters, and they're called synaptic vesicles. So this green area here is actually a terminal bud of an axon. And then inside here, there's all these little synaptic vesicles, the blue and orange, look like bubbles, I guess. And they all contain neurotransmitters in here. And this is what gets secreted into the synapse or the synaptic cleft when an action potential happens. And then the dendrites from the other neurons absorb those neurotransmitters. And then whatever's left over, sometimes it floats around in our nervous system, but much of the time it also gets reabsorbed back into those little synaptic vesicles. Each vesicle can contain up to about 10,000 neurotransmitter molecules, which is pretty amazing. So there's two different types of neurotransmitters. There's two different ways neurotransmitters can act, I guess, in the nervous system. And there are neurotransmitters that act as both. There are drugs that act as both as well. But you want to know what these two terms mean. So agonists actually boost receptors. So they mimic or strengthen the effect of neurotransmitters. Agonists, I can't speak, activate receptors and increase the effect of different neurotransmitters. Smoking and vaping also, it's really the nicotine, I probably should change this, actually boosts acetylcholine, which increases our brain activity and boosts energy. So smoking is an agonist, and the problem with smoking is that the nicotine wears off within a few hours, and then you want another cigarette or another vape, and it just kind of starts a vicious cycle, and you feel worse afterwards. You feel good for a little bit, and then you feel terrible until you get that next hit of nicotine. So smoking is an agonist. Caffeine is also an agonist that most of us are more familiar with. It boosts our adenosine receptors, and it gives us energy and makes us feel good as well. But it does boost activity in the nervous system. Antagonists do the opposite. So they block neurotransmitter receptors so that fewer messages get sent, and it slows the transmission of messages. So why would we want to do that? Well, our antipsychotic medications are antagonists for dopamine. So they block dopamine receptors and they decrease the amount of dopamine in the system. So both antagonists and agonists bind to receptor sites, but antagonists slow messages, whereas agonists increase activity and activate those receptors. So here's an example of different neurotransmitters and their psychological effects. So dopamine is kind of our feel-good neurotransmitter. It improves our mood. It's kind of the pleasure neurotransmitter. I don't know what it does. I think it reduces our appetite. But we know that too much dopamine is not a good thing. So people who suffer from schizophrenia have too much dopamine in their system. People who suffer from bipolar disorder and they're in that manic phase and just out of touch with reality, having some psychotic symptoms, they have too much dopamine in their system. And so our antipsychotic medications reduce this level of dopamine and actually are able to reduce some of those symptoms. Dopamine is also involved in Parkinson's patients are deficient. They have low levels of dopamine in their system. And we know that dopamine has a lot to do with movement as well. And it has a lot to do with addictions as well. So it's a really important neurotransmitter to understand in psychology. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter you may have heard about that participates in mood, appetite, and sleep. So people that have low levels of serotonin often are depressed and sometimes are also anxious. We have found that people who are depressed have low levels of serotonin, and people with anxiety also often have lower levels of serotonin. So antidepressant medications can work to increase this level of serotonin, improve a depressed mood, and improve anxiety symptoms as well. We know that anxiety and depression often go together, and a lot of times the more depressed you are, the more you start to worry and the more anxiety you have. So if we can improve that depression level, we can also improve a lot of the anxiety symptoms. But we know that people who suffer from pretty severe anxiety disorders have lower levels of serotonin, and often an antidepressant can be really helpful. The last neurotransmitter that you can't probably quite see on here is norepinephrine, and that is also involved in depression, but it's also involved in arousal and vigilance and giving us energy, suppressing our appetite. But one of the newer treatments for depression now, for people who aren't responding very well to increasing an antidepressant that increases the serotonin level, they're actually adding a second antidepressant that works on this norepinephrine level. So somebody who's severely depressed and lacking energy might benefit from a second antidepressant that helps give them energy. People that suffer from anxiety probably would not benefit from this. If you have too much norepinephrine in your system, it can cause anxiety. But we know neurotransmitters play a really strong role in all of the psychological disorders. And, the reason we've been able to develop medications for many of the psychological disorders has to do with our understanding of neurotransmitters and the nervous system. We've only had medications since the 1960s for any of the psychological disorders. The antipsychotic medications were the first medications to be developed in the 1960s. And the first medications had some pretty severe side effects, and these medications have been perfected, and there's less and less side effects today. Many of our medications, especially our antidepressant medications, have very low side effects. So I wanted to just talk about SSRI so that you kind of know what that is. So an SSRI stands for a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's a big mouthful. But many of the antidepressant medications you may have heard of are Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft. There are some newer antidepressants I don't know about on here that are probably also SSRIs, and they keep coming up with newer ones with less side effects that seem to be more effective. So it's a constant work in progress, coming up with medications to treat different psychological disorders. So these particular antidepressants work by increasing the level of serotonin. And what they do is it's called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So what they do is they block the terminal buds of the axon, and they prevent that neurotransmitter, prevent the serotonin from getting reabsorbed back into that terminal bud. And what that does is it allows for that neurotransmitter, the serotonin, to remain in the system longer, and it allows a lot more serotonin into the system, which increases the mood and decreases depression. So that's why it's called that SSRI. And then it prevents the reabsorption of unused neurotransmitters back into the neuron, because the neurons, the serotonin does get absorbed into the dendrites of the next neuron, but there's always a lot left over in that synaptic cleft, and it usually gets reabsorbed, but this prevents that reabsorption. So psychotropic medications are those medications I'm talking about that were developed in the 1960s, and they work by restoring neurotransmitter balance. So they really think that these neurotransmitters are involved in the psychological disorders, and if we can restore that balance, we can treat the disorders. And truth is, we have a lot of different medications for different psychological disorders, and we've had some pretty good success in treatment of different psychological disorders, but we don't really have a cure for psychological disorders. People that suffer from schizophrenia, medications help them and they reduce some of the symptoms, but they don't fix all of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And then, we've done a really good job of perfecting a lot of these medications and reducing the side effects, but there still are other problems that people suffer from when they have a mental health disorder or psychological disorder, even if they are taking medication. And I always try to highlight that, because I think people sometimes think, well, if they only took their medication, they would be fine. And unfortunately, wish it would work that way, but it doesn't exactly work that way. And this is just an example. If you find this information really interesting, biopsychology is a class that you can take that really goes into depth about the nervous system, the brain, all sorts of anything that's related to psychology from the biological system. And it's called Psych 275. And you can take any upper division psychology course once you finish Psych 101. So this would be the next level if you'd want to take that. But there's also developmental psychology and other things as well. You don't have to take them in any particular order. So that is it on neurons and neurotransmitters. Thanks for listening.